All right, let's talk about Watergate. And there's a few things I want you to take away from this whole Watergate scandal. And the number one thing is this: freedom of the press matters. And in the case of Watergate, the free press, the independent press in America, saved our republic. And we'll talk about that here in just a minute. But what exactly happened at Watergate? Well, see, in 1972, Richard Nixon was poised, like I said in just a minute ago in an earlier lecture. Nixon is poised for a massive re-election victory. But it was very important for Nixon to win in a landslide. Now, for years building up to his re-election, Nixon was afraid of a challenge by Ted Kennedy, the Kennedy brother, the younger brother of Robert and John Kennedy. But he didn't have to worry about that because Ted Kennedy had a little bit of a scandal that you can look up. Look up Chappaquiddick if you want to see what's going on there. And Ted Kennedy was not a candidate in 72. Now, the Democrats end up just having a disastrous convention in 1972. Matter of fact, their main speaker, the guy gets their nomination, George McGovern. He doesn't even go on TV till like 1 in the morning and give his acceptance speech. It's not good. But Richard Nixon, going into 72, was touting all of his foreign policy victories. And going into 72, he wanted to smash the Democrats. He wanted basically revenge for 1960 and revenge for losing the 62 governor's race in California. Nixon had always felt like an outsider. He was not an Ivy Leaguer. He was from the West. He was from California. So he always felt like he had something to prove. But there's a sinister side to Richard Nixon. Nixon would just ramble on at times in the White House, in the Oval Office. And by 1972, there's way too many people in the White House that is starting to take his ramblings a little seriously. Let me give you an example. People would talk about some of his political enemies, and Nixon would go, well, what we ought to do is break into their house or slash their tires or something extreme. And most normal, logical people would go, nah, that's just the president talking off the top of his head. But as we get closer to the end of Nixon's presidency, the people around him actually start taking it seriously. And there was a group of people in the Nixon White House. They were called the plumbers. They went around and fixed his problems. And they're going to end up causing Nixon a lot of problems. See, in 1972, the National Democrat Party headquarters was located in the Watergate Hotel and Office Complex inside of Washington, D.C. I've seen the building. It's hideous. It looks like the Brady Bunch house, to be honest with you. It looks like something Mike Brady would have designed. Not a pretty building. It's very stuck in the era in which it was built. But anyway, several men that are connected to the committee to re-elect Richard Nixon, they break in to the Democrat Party national headquarters at Watergate. And they're trying to put listening devices inside the Democrat Party national headquarters so they can spy on them. Well, they are absolute idiots, to put it bluntly. They tape the door so they can get in later so the doors don't lock, and they tape as in a way that the tape is exposed. And security guards find them, they call the police, and these guys are arrested. Well, everybody kind of brushes it off as just some random guys breaking into the Democrat Party national headquarters. Until they find address books on the burglars that have the names of people who work for Richard Nixon. They have the names of people who work in the White House and for the committee to re-elect the president. Also, they had a lot of money on them, which was also connected back to people close to Richard Nixon. Now, it is generally accepted that Richard Nixon had no prior knowledge of the break-in. Most people accept that. But what Nixon does with the break-in is equally as criminal as if he had something to do with it. Nixon is going to use the power of the White House and the presidency to shut down investigations into the burglary. And not only that, Nixon is going to use the power of the presidency not just to shut down investigations, but to protect people close to him and intimidate people who are going forth with these investigations. Well, thankfully, there are two young reporters in Washington, D.C. by the name of Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein. Yes, the famous Woodward and Bernstein. Now, these two guys are going to show us exactly why freedom of the press is important. Because they smell a rat in Watergate. And they, along with other reporters, continue to investigate and follow the leads of Watergate until they find out that the cover-up, the break-in, everything else leads right back to the desk of Richard Nixon. So as they start to expose who was behind the cover-up and everything else, Congress starts to investigate Watergate. And through these televised hearings into the Watergate scandal, it is revealed that Richard Nixon records every conversation in the Oval Office. Now, this is nothing new. JFK recorded his conversations in the Oval Office. Lyndon B. Johnson recorded his conversation. But Nixon's recording device is sound-powered. So anytime anyone speaks, it kicks on. Well, this revelation in the congressional hearings leads to the Supreme Court telling President Nixon that he must turn over his tapes. And when he does, there is what's known as a smoking gun. The tapes reveal that Nixon is knowingly trying to cover up the Watergate break-in. Nixon is abusing power. Nixon has basically by the way, he won every single state in 1972 but one. I mean, it was a massive presidential victory. So all of this was completely unnecessary. But Nixon has basically, well, he's violated his oath as President of the United States of America. So they start to move to impeach President Nixon. But rather than be impeached, because Nixon was not just going to be impeached, he was most likely going to be removed from office, and then criminal charges were going to follow. It was going to be an absolute disaster for Nixon. So Nixon goes on TV in 1974 and announces that he is going to resign as President of the United States of America. No president before or since has ever resigned. Well, when the president can't finish out his term in office for whatever reason, who steps in? The vice president. That's right. In this case, the vice president was Gerald R. Ford, who was a football player for Michigan. But the interesting thing about Ford is he was not Nixon's vice presidential nominee in the 72 election. That was Spiro T. Agnew. But after Nixon and Agnew get elected in 72, Agnew has to step down because he has some scandals come to light from his previous time in government. So Richard Nixon appoints Gerald Ford to be president or vice president of the United States of America. Then when Nixon steps down, Ford is now president. He was never elected to the vice presidency. He was never elected to the presidency. So Gerald Ford is the only president to never be elected at all, period. And Nixon is the only president to ever resign. Now, what do we take away from the Watergate era? We take away the fact, like I said earlier, that freedom of the press is essential to protecting the constitutional republic of the United States of America. Woodward and Bernstein, who were threatened by the White House, a lot of people looked at them as traitors. They are honestly heroes. Hey, one time in Washington, D.C., I was eating at a restaurant, and Bob Woodward was like 2 tables over from me. So we're like friends. I mean, we're pretty tight, But it proves that not everything is exactly as it looks. Nixon looked like this super patriotic, concerned, dedicated president, but it turns out he was involved in criminal activities. So we can take away from the Watergate experience that we shouldn't judge Richard Nixon entirely by Watergate, even though that should be the main title of his presidency, because he'd done some good things, as we mentioned earlier. But we should always remember that we got to keep an eye on the people in charge. Whether they're your party or the other party, it's our job to keep an eye on the people that we send to Washington, D.C. So Richard Nixon is now basically, well, he's one of the most hated men in America as he leaves office in 1974. But the 1970s are not going to be a good decade for the United States of America. And it's not just because of disco. Yeah, that was funny. But it's also because we are going to face massive recessions. We are going to face terrible times in the Cold War. All of that's going to happen. And of course, coming up soon, we're going to meet Jimmy Carter. But after Jimmy Carter, we are going to meet a guy who restores the confidence of the United States of America. And that's him right back here on my wall. That is President Ronald Reagan. So we'll pick up there in another lecture. I hope this helps explain what we have in our section of notes. And again, I miss all of you, and I can't wait to get back to school.